Okay, we're online. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our live stream with a Q&A about Pentagon spending. So I'm Julia Newman. I've been sending you all these emails for the past few weeks. And I'm here with Jim Kaysen, who is, among many other things here at FCNL, our lead lobbyist on issues of Pentagon spending right now. And so he is here to give you an introduction to this issue, as well as and what's happening here in DC. If you've been watching the news, you know that it's been a big day for Pentagon spending, and so. And he's also going to let you know why it's so important that you are here or at home lobbying this coming April, and why your advocacy is going to make a really big difference. Then we'll get into the questions that you submitted both online, and if we have time, those of you who are watching here will be able to open up to some additional questions. So Jim, what's happening here in DC?
Well, thanks, Julia, and great to be with all of you around the country. This is such an important issue, and as you said, right now in mid-March, we're really seeing the outlines of what our new president is proposing, and we're also, I think it really reinforces for us the importance of efforts around the country to really work to prevent these increases in Pentagon spending. Today, the president made a big proposal to increase Pentagon spending next year by over $50 billion, and he's trying to increase Pentagon spending this year. And I think before we get into all of the other reasons that this is important, I think it's important for all of us all of you around the country, and certainly for us here in Washington, to recognize that this is about choices. This is about what are the choices that our elected officials make for how our government works, but also how we work as a society. As a Quaker organization, we start from a premise that we seek a world free of war and the threat of war. And so as a matter of faith, we don't think increasing Pentagon spending is a good idea. I would also say, and I think we would say, that as a matter of public policy, increasing Pentagon spending right now is a big mistake. It's a big mistake for several reasons. One, it's a big mistake because we already spend too much on the Pentagon. Pentagon spending right now, just the core spending, without talking about the cost of past wars and all of those other things, is about $600 billion, billion dollars a year. That is at the same level as it was at the height of the Cold War. That is, we spend more as one country on the Pentagon and on the military than the next 7 countries combined. So we're spending this enormous amount on military force. Our president is now coming in and saying we need to spend additional money. The number he's come up with is $54 billion in the next fiscal year 2018. And he's saying, in order to put that money there, we need to go over here and reduce spending on diplomacy and development, on the Environmental Protection Agency, and on lots of other federal agencies that we would argue, and I think a lot of people around the country would agree, really also make our country safer and more secure. So we look at this and say that this spending proposal of the president is a mistake. We think that any increase in Pentagon spending right now is a mistake, that $600 billion is already too much, but certainly that what you can do around the country very effectively is you can go into congressional offices and say, do not vote for any increase in Pentagon spending this year or next. And members of Congress will have opportunities to vote repeatedly on proposals to increase Pentagon spending. There'll be one vote right after the April recess that'll be on current year funding, and then there'll be a series of other votes, Julia, coming up in May and June and July and September, and probably all the way until December, where members of Congress will be asked to decide yes or no on whether to increase Pentagon spending. And what we really hope people around the country do is go into those offices and say, these are not my priorities, I don't believe this is a good idea, and I hope you'll vote against increasing Pentagon spending. Now, the other thing I'll just say, and I know we don't have that much time, is I hear from lots of people around the country, well, my member of Congress is pretty conservative and he's certainly not Quaker. How do I go in and make that kind of argument? And if you think about what I said, I always believe you should go in first with your own values and your own faith. But we're not here to try and make Congress Quaker. We're here to try and talk to Congress and talk to our elected officials about what's good public policy. And I think there's a strong argument to be made that increasing Pentagon spending right now is not good public policy. On our website, we also have a number of other resources that talk about a secondary part of this issue, which is also important, which is, as I said, $600 billion. There's a lot of money in that $600 billion that is just simply wasted. There's some of it that's literally fraud, that's going to enrich military contractors. And we have lists on the website of specific items that we think are particularly wasteful. The Pentagon's own study, which they did in 2015 and was leaked to the press in December of last year, found $125 billion in savings that the Pentagon could make in their own agency. And I think I'll just end, because I know you've got a bunch of questions. Are there probably things that I've missed that you can remind me of? By saying the other piece of this is that every federal agency is required under law to be audited. And the one cabinet agency that hasn't been audited and has never even gotten to the point where they could be audited is the Pentagon. So approaching a senator or a representative and saying, okay, well, we may not agree on Pentagon spending, but surely we could agree that we shouldn't give these guys more money until they can account for where they're spending the money now.
Yeah, that's great. We got lots of questions about the $125 billion of waste that the Pentagon apparently reported, and people really want to know how to bring that into offices and also what Congress can do about it. And it sounds like an audit is the first step. Are there other things that people should be asking their member to do?
There are both Republican and Democratic members of Congress who have been speaking out about the incredible cost overruns and the problems in Pentagon accounting. And I think this is a bipartisan issue where we find the Republican chair of the Budget Committee in the Senate wrote a letter to the new Secretary of Defense saying, what about this $125 billion? What are you going to do about it? So I think raising that, as you know, and as you're training all of us, Julia, I think always important to stay with what's your core ask in these offices. And so the core ask for us on this issue is do not vote for any legislation that increases Pentagon spending. A sort of secondary ask, or part of that, would be to ask the staff that you're meeting with or the members you're meeting with what they're doing to engage the Pentagon to try and get them to look at the cost overruns in the F-35 airplane. And there's a whole list of things, again, on the website, or the amounts of money that the Pentagon is proposing spending on modernizing, quote unquote, the nuclear weapons fleet, a fleet, of course, that we hope we'll never use. So I think that is, in a way, if I was meeting with you and you were a congressional staffer, I would say, well, Julia, I hope that the senator will really take some real public positions speaking out against this kind of waste, fraud, and abuse. And I'd be interested to know, how are you engaging with the Pentagon to look at the savings that they themselves identified in administrative costs through this study? Have you signed on, has your senator signed on to a letter about that issue? Would they be willing to speak out and really say that they hope the Pentagon does meet its deadline, which is this year, to be audit ready? So not even to be audited yet, but the deadline under law right now is for the Pentagon in 27 to at least have its books together so they could be audited. And could the senator, again, thinking about you as a staff person, could the senator write a letter to the Pentagon asking them whether they will be ready, or join with people in different committees to do that?
Great.
Sure.
Yeah. So one thing you talked earlier a little bit about how, you know, Republican offices might not agree with you, but this really is not a particularly partisan issue, correct?
I think we find across the board there are lots of Democrats and lots of Republicans who support increasing Pentagon spending. And frankly, for lots of members of Congress, they see it as a hard vote to vote against more military spending. And so really very important to engage with Democratic and Republican offices. At FCNL, I probably visit more Republican offices than I visit Democrat offices right now. In the Senate, the margin of whether or not they increase Pentagon spending this year will probably come from 5 or 6 Democrats, because they need 60 votes in the Senate to actually pass this legislation. There are only 52 Republicans. And some of the Republicans, by the way, are stronger opponents of growing Pentagon spending than the Democrats are.
Great. There have been lots of conversations as this budget has come out about sequestration. And one person wrote in asking, saying that they had heard that the spending increases are just trying to get us back to where we were before sequestration. A word I still can't say. What is the response to that type of argument? And can you explain a little bit about what sequestration is if it comes up in offices?
Sure. Let me see if I can do this in a nutshell. So back in 2011, Congress was, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were winding down. There were the beginnings of these big withdrawals of troops from those areas, and there was a lot of pressure from what they call fiscal hawks, people who are concerned about budget deficits, to reduce federal government spending. And so they passed a Budget Control Act, which called for dramatic declines in spending across the board. One of the things we got into that legislation was that if domestic spending that wasn't Pentagon was going to be reduced, then Pentagon spending had to be reduced as well. And so Pentagon spending has come down from the height of when the U.S. had 100,000 or more troops in Iraq and Afghanistan and another 100,000 contractors. So there been, thanks to advocacy around the country, I would argue, there's been some decrease in Pentagon spending. And so we do hear when we go into offices that, in fact, restoring $54 billion in spending next year would bring Pentagon spending up to the levels projected by the military 5 years ago or 6 years ago. So that there's some truth there. The reality is that domestic spending has come down even further because the Pentagon has always had this wiggle room of overseas contingency operations, war spending that hasn't been part of the budget cap. So Pentagon spending has gone down, but as I said earlier, even when you take it to the level it is now and you go back to the Cold War over here, it's actually still at or above the levels of the Cold War and the Vietnam War in real terms, inflation-adjusted terms. So we would argue that Pentagon right now has plenty of money. We would say too much money. Certainly doesn't need to see increases in spending. And certainly this proposal coming from the president today that says, let's grow Pentagon spending by $54 billion, and then let's reduce spending on diplomacy and development. Let's reduce spending on the Environmental Protection Agency. Let's reduce spending on housing for low-income people. Let's reduce the spending on programs like WIC that are actually for women with children as an income support. We would say that those other spending priorities are part of what make us safer as a society. And in some sense, I would even say the president has presented a stark choice to Congress and the American people. Do we want to grow militarism, grow our focus on, in effect, brute force at the expense of diplomacy and looking ahead to prevent wars in the future? Sequester is part of that 2011 bill that has said there has to be a cap on overall spending, and half of it can go to the military and half of it can go to domestic spending. And if you break that cap, as the president proposes and increase Pentagon and reduce the other, then that will be a disaster for our society.
Great. And so this is leads very well into our next question, which is, this it's hard to go into offices to talk about budget issues when you don't feel like an expert, and especially if the staffer is an expert. So how do you make this feel more personal and feel more connected to you and your community, and not like this problem that's happening in Washington far away from you?
That's a great question, and I would say, I maybe shouldn't say this, I don't know if my boss is watching or not, but I feel like often the staff know more than I do about these issues. So it really is, I think what we're going into these offices with, and what I would encourage constituents around the country to go into the offices with, is our values and our experiences in the community. So one approach, of course, is to go in and say, I come from this Quaker community, and my faith leads me to believe that this is a mistake. A lot of people, when I first asked them, what's your connection, go, well, I don't have any connection to Pentagon spending. But particularly as these are trade-offs, think about, does your meeting or your church have a food pantry? Do you give money for the homeless? Are you concerned about the schools in your area? Do you know someone in your community who used to be a diplomat or worked in an international organization? Start with that experience. I had a great experience in Tampa, Florida, if I could just say this, of someone who said, well, I don't really have any experience with this, Jim. No, I don't. And so we talked for about a minute, and then she said, well, I work in an emergency room, and I'm a social worker. And I had a man come in at the end of last month by ambulance, and I said, well, why are you here? And he says, because I'm hungry, I have mobility issues, I've run out of food assistance, and I needed an ambulance to get me to the hospital because I knew you would feed me. How can we be in a society where someone has to call an ambulance just to not starve to death in their own apartment? We need to prioritize that money for food. We need to prioritize that money for housing. We need to prioritize that money. And I think, I said to her, go in with that story and then say, and I hear that you're going to reduce money for all of these things that I care about, like food for people at the end of the month, and you're going to grow the Pentagon spending. That doesn't make sense in terms of what my priorities are. That's much more the important story that you can take into a congressional office than arguing about or discussing all of these $600 billion numbers and all of that, because they will know more about that than we do. And we know, you know, Julia, and I know from going into offices and from the surveys that Congressional Management Foundation does, that that's what the staffers want to hear. They want to hear your connection, why this is important to you, why this is a heart issue for you, much more than they want you to break down all the pricing.
Great, yeah. Well, that's about all the time we'll have.
Oh, goodness.
But I will just add that, you know, the news today on the 16th about the president's budget is pretty overwhelming, I think, for a lot of us, seeing all of the things that are being cut. But that is not going to be the final budget that gets passed by Congress. A thing I have to remind myself to calm myself down and be a little bit less upset about it. But what will not get cut, and the choices that Congress makes are going to be made by what they hear from constituents and what programs you say that you really care about and make sure you want them to prioritize. And so using this as a way to advocate for the budget that you think your community needs is, I think, really important. So.
And if I would just add one thing, we really need you. Your work is really what's going to change this. And you're lobbying in April, and you're staying engaged with these offices. We can stop this. We can prevent this Pentagon spending increase from happening. But it's going to take all of us around the country getting into those offices.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jim. And if you have other questions, please do send them our way, and we'll hopefully be able to answer them in other ways throughout this course as you prepare for your visit in April.
Thank you.